The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Mara had always considered the cruelest day of the week, not Monday, which at least had the dignity of being obviously terrible. Tuesday pretended things might improve, and then didn't. She was sitting in the visitation room of Harlow Women's Correctional Facility when the guard slid the envelope under the reinforced glass, and she stared at it for a full 30 seconds before picking it up. Her name was written in ink so dark it looked like it had been pressed into the paper rather than drawn on it. Mara Elise Voss. No return address, no postage mark, just her name, written in the hand of someone who'd learned penmanship before ballpoint pens She opened it with hands that had learned steadiness in prison, the way other women learned yoga or makram. 2 years had taught her a great many things about stillness. The paper inside was cream-colored and heavy, the kind that cost more per sheet than her daily meals. The letter was short. She read it twice, then a third time. The way she'd once read contracts before her life had become a series of events she'd stopped being able to predict. Miss Voss, I am aware of your situation. I am aware of the charges, the timeline, and the truth of what happened, all three of which differ considerably from one another. I have a proposal that may interest you. I am in need of a wife, not for romance, not for companionship in any conventional sense. I require a legal marriage, entered willingly, by a woman of specific qualities. You meet every qualification. In exchange for your consent, I will ensure your immediate release, the expungement of your record, and the financial security of yourself and your mother for the remainder of her life. You will want for nothing material. You will be safe. If you agree, send no response. Simply tell your attorney, whose fees I have already settled, that you accept the arrangement. You have 72 hours. The letter was signed with a single name. Kyle. No last name. No title. No explanation of how a stranger had read her file, paid her attorney, or located her in a facility whose visitor list she hadn't updated in 8 months since her mother's last visit had been too painful for either of them to repeat. Mara set the letter down on the scratched table and looked at the wall. The wall was institutional beige, the color of bureaucratic indifference. She'd memorized every crack in it over 2 years. She knew which cracks spread in winter when the pipes expanded. She knew which corner caught afternoon light and turned it almost gold for exactly 11 minutes each day around 3 o'clock. She'd learned to find beauty in small, ration-sized portions. She thought about what she was going back to if she served the full sentence. 14 months remaining, a record that would follow her like a shadow, with better stamina than she had. A mother whose medical bills had been the reason everything had unraveled in the first place. She hadn't stolen the money out of greed. She'd taken it out of desperation so pure and specific it had its own shape. Like a stone she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her body. Her employer had known that, had counted on it, had set her up with the kind of precision that required planning and resources she hadn't understood at the time. By the time she'd understood, the evidence was arranged, the witnesses were prepared, and Mara Elise Voss was standing in a courtroom, being described as a woman of poor moral character by a man who'd manufactured every piece of paper in the prosecutor. She'd had a public defender. He'd done his best. It hadn't been enough. She picked the letter up again, read it a 4th time, noticed that it didn't say where she'd be going, didn't say what being his wife would require beyond willingness, didn't explain who he was or why her specifically. She thought about her mother's voice on their last phone call 3 weeks ago, the careful way Eleanor Voss said she was fine in the tone that meant she was anything but. The pause before she'd said, the heat had been repaired in the apartment, which Mara had recognized immediately as a lie, because the landlord had been threatening eviction for 2 months, and heat repairs required a functioning landlord. The wall was still beige. The letter was still. The choice was not really a choice at all, which was the thing about desperation that nobody told you until you were standing inside it. It didn't feel like freedom narrowing. It felt like clarity expanding, brutal and specific, all the unnecessary options burning away until only one remained. Mara folded the letter along its original crease, placed it in the pocket of her uniform, asked the guard to take her back to her cell. And in the morning, she called the attorney's office and said 3 words into the phone with the same steadiness she'd taught her hands. She said, "I accept it." The paperwork moved with a speed that should have been impossible for a legal system Mara had experienced as glacial and indifferent. Within 36 hours, a different attorney appeared, this one wearing a suit that cost what Mara used to make in a month, carrying documents that bore official seals she didn't recognize alongside ones she did. Within 48 hours, she was standing in a processing room, being given back the clothes she'd arrived in 2 years ago, which fit differently now, looser across the shoulders where she'd grown leaner, tighter across her hands, which had developed a kind of density that came from surviving rather than living. She signed things. She was told she was being released on a legal technicality that the attorney declined to specify. She was told her record had been flagged for review. She was told a car would be waiting. The car was black and long and driven by a man who said nothing except good afternoon, and opened the door with the precision of someone who'd made an art form of efficiency. Inside smelled of leather and something else, something faintly mineral, like stone that had been near water for centuries. She watched the facility disappear in the rear window and felt nothing she had a name for. Relief was too small. Grief was too large. What she felt was something in between, the particular emotional frequency of a chapter ending before you were certain you'd understood it. They drove for 4 hours. The city dissolved into suburbs, suburbs into highway, highway into countryside that grew progressively wilder, the trees pressing closer to the road as if curious about the car passing beneath them. The light changed too, grew thicker somehow, more amber than afternoon light had any right to be at this hour. She fell asleep without meaning to, the first real sleep she'd had in 2 years that wasn't measured and interrupted and institutionally timed. When she woke, they were stopped. Before her was a house. Calling it a house was like calling the ocean a puddle. It was stone and height and windows that caught the last of the evening light and held it. A building that looked like it had opinions about the landscape it occupied. Opinions that had been there longer than the road they'd driven in on. Standing at the entrance was a man. He was tall in the way that certain things were tall not just in measurement, but in presence, the way old trees were tall, or mountains, or silences that had accumulated weight. His hair was dark, and his eyes, when they found hers through the car window, were the color of something she didn't have a word for. Not quite gray, not quite silver. The color of deep water in a place where light arrived as a rumor rather than a fact. He was watching her with an expression she recognized, not from experience, but from instinct. The expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time and had made peace with waiting, but was not, in this moment, unaffected by the ending of it. The door opened. Mara stepped out into air that smelled of pine and earth, and that same faint mineral quality she'd noticed in the car, stronger here, as if its source was nearby. He said, "Miss Voss." His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had never needed to raise itself to be heard. "Thank you for coming." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I didn't have many alternatives." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. Not quite a smile. The shadow a smile might cast if the light were coming from an unusual angle. "You had one alternative," he said. "You chose this one. I appreciate the distinction." His name was KL. No last name offered. He led her inside, and the house was warm and impossibly quiet. The kind of quiet that was the absence of city noise rather than the absence of sound. She could hear the building itself, its old beams settling, somewhere the sound of water moving underground. He showed her to rooms that were hers, he said, for as long as she was here. They were large and furnished with things that were old without being decrepit, beautiful without being performative. A bed with dark carved wood, bookshelves that reached the ceiling and were full, a fireplace that was already lit. She stood in the center of it and thought about her prison cell, about the specific dimensions of it, and felt something enormous and disorienting that she eventually identified as she turned to find him still in the doorway. "I have questions," she said. "I expected you would," he said. "Who are you?" He was quiet for a moment. Someone who needed exactly what you agreed to provide. A wife. Willing, clear-eyed. He paused. Someone who understood that some contracts are made between equals, even when the circumstances appear unequal. "That didn't answer my question," she said. "No," he agreed. "It didn't." He looked at her steadily. "Tomorrow, I'll answer more of them. Tonight, you should sleep. Your mother's accounts have been settled. She has a nurse beginning tomorrow morning. She knows only that you've been released and that you're safe." Mara's throat tightened in the way it did when she was keeping something together by willpower alone. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level. She'd learned that too. "Good night, Miss Voss." "Mara," she said, "if we're going to be married, you should probably use my name." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary. "Mara," he said quietly, as if the word meant something specific to him, as if he'd been holding it carefully before being allowed to say it aloud. Then, he was gone, and she was alone in a room that was more beautiful than anything she'd slept in 2 years, and she sat on the edge of the bed and let her hands shake for exactly 3 minutes, the way she'd learned to ration the falling apart so it didn't swallow the holding together. Then, she lay down, and for the first time in 2 years, she slept without counting the hours until morning came with light that moved differently than she was used to. In the facility, morning had been fluorescent and immediate, arriving like a command. Here it came gradually, filtering through curtains the color of deep water, warming slowly across the wooden floor, finding her face with a gentleness that felt almost apologetic, as if the sun understood this was an adjustment. She lay still for a moment, locating herself the way she'd learned to do, cataloging the sensory details until she remembered where she was, and why, and what she'd agreed to, and what it meant for the 48 hours preceding this moment. Stone house. Black car. A man named Kyle with eyes like deep water and a voice that had never needed volume to a marriage contract she hadn't read the fine print on, because there hadn't been any fine print, just a letter and a decision and the particular logic of someone who had run out of other options. She dressed in the clothes that had appeared on the chair beside the bed, which had not been there when she'd fallen asleep. This should have unsettled her more than it did. Prison had recalibrated her relationship with privacy in ways she was still mapping. The clothes were simple and well made, dark trousers and a soft gray shirt, and they fit her precisely, which was either coincidence or information. She found the kitchen by following the smell of coffee, which was strong and real, and the first genuinely good thing she'd encountered in 2 years that wasn't a memory. Kyle was already there, standing at the window with a cup, looking out at grounds that stretched further than she'd expected, the garden dissolving into something wilder at its edges, trees that grew old and close together, the light between them thick and green. He heard her and turned. There was something in the way he did it, a contained, like a person who was always slightly more aware of their surroundings than the situation seemed to require. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Better than I have in 2 years," she said. She poured herself coffee and stood on the opposite side of the kitchen island, which felt like the right distance, not hostile. Measured, she'd always been good at reading the geometry of social situations, knowing how close was safe and how close was statement. Prison had refined this into something closer to science. "You said you'd answer questions," she said. "I did," he said. She looked at him over her cup. "Who are you? Not what you do. Who you are." He was quiet for a moment that stretched comfortably, the silence of someone who wasn't searching for words, but was choosing them with care. "I am very old," he said finally. "I belong to a line that has existed longer than the country we're standing in. My family has certain obligations, certain requirements, one of which is that a king must have a queen before he can be recognized as fully sovereign by the laws that govern my kind." She set her cup down. "Your kind," she repeated. He met her eyes. "I am not human, Mara. Not entirely. Not in the ways that matter most." She waited. He said, "The world you know is the surface of a much larger thing. Beneath it, in places where stone and water and old power have accumulated across centuries, there are kingdoms. Courts, hierarchies older than anything written in any history book you've encountered. I rule one of them. Or, I will," he added, "when I have fulfilled the requirements of succession. Which include a willing human bride." She looked at him for a long, measured moment. Her face was doing the thing it had learned to do, staying still while her mind moved quickly underneath. She thought about the speed of her release, the lawyer with the unplaceable firm, the 4-hour drive into increasingly strange countryside, the light that moved wrong, the sound of water underground. "Why human?" she said. He almost smiled. "Because humans understand mortality in a way my kind has forgotten. The old laws were written by those who believed a king should be grounded in what passes, should understand what it costs to lose something irreplaceable. They believed that a human queen would be a conscience, a reminder that power has consequences, and time runs in one direction." She thought about this. Then she said, "And you chose me specific. From what possible pool of candidates does a woman in a women's correctional facility emerge as the optimal choice?" He looked at her steadily. "You were accused of a crime you didn't commit because you were trying to keep your mother alive. You served 2 years in a facility that does not favor the uncorrupted, and you emerged from it with your character intact. More than intact. The report I received from the psychologist who assessed you 18 months ago, which I obtained through, means I won't bore you with described you as possessing unusual moral clarity and resistance to institutional pressure." He paused. "I needed someone who had been tested and hadn't bent." "You didn't bend, Mara." She was quiet. "Also," he added, and something in his voice shifted fractionally. "Almost. You were innocent. That mattered to me." She picked up her coffee, drank, put it down. Outside the window, a bird landed on the garden wall and then departed with a sound like a small, sharp decision. "What does being your queen actually require?" she said. He was quiet for a moment that felt less like hesitation and more like respect. "The ceremony," he said. "The vows, your presence at court for a period, learning what you need to learn." After that he paused, the duration of the pause carrying its own specific weight after that. "The arrangement is yours to define. I won't hold you to more than you agreed to." She looked at him. "That's a very careful way of saying something." "I'm a very careful person," he said. "So am I," she said. She looked out the window. "What is it called?" "Your kingdom." He said the name. It was a word in a language she didn't recognize, 2 syllables that sounded like the compound of a very old sound and a newer one, like a word that had been translated once and carried some ghost of the original in its current shape. "Viel Dorn," he said. "It means, roughly, the deep country," though the translation loses something essential. She repeated it quietly. Viel Dorn. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention again, the kind that was conscious of itself. As if he knew he was watching and had decided it was worth the transparency. "When?" she said. "Tonight," he said. "If you're willing." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the light was doing something unusual in the garden, moving like water over the old stone, and she thought about 14 months of institutional beige, about her mother's careful voice, lying about the heating, about a letter written in ink that pressed into paper rather than sitting on top of it. "All right," she said. "Tonight," She spent the day being prepared by a woman named Saren, who appeared at 10 o'clock and explained things with the brisk competence of someone who found anxiety in it. Saren was small and ageless, with the kind of face that had settled into its final form early and stayed there, and she moved through the house as if she knew where everything was, because she'd put it there personally. She dressed Mara in something the color of twilight, a deep blue-gray that shifted in the light. She explained the vows, which were short and precise, and what they would mean, which she explained in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reading a legal document rather than describing a supernatural covenant. She explained the court, who would be present, what they would expect, what Mara should and should not show them. Show them nothing, Saren said, that you don't intend to give them. They'll take whatever you offer and file it under useful information. What should I show them? Mara. Saren looked at her with something that might have been appreciation. Exactly what you're showing me now, she said. That you're paying attention and you're not afraid. I am afraid, Mara said. Of course you are, Saren said. But you're paying attention anyway. That's the relevant part. The descent began at dusk. Mara had expected it, something obvious and architectural, a trapdoor or a passage hidden behind a bookcase in the way of stories she'd read as a child. Before, stories had been replaced by case files and financial records and the particular literature of people trying to survive in systems designed to let them fall. What she found instead was a garden path that led to the old trees at the property's edge, and beyond those trees, a clearing where the ground itself changed, became something older. The stone underfoot was dark and smooth, worn by feet that had passed over it across more years than she could hold in her mind without the concept becoming abstract. Kael walked beside her. He'd changed into something formal, dark and structured, that made him look more himself, as if the daytime clothes had been a concession to a world he visited rather than inhabited. He didn't offer his arm or his hand. He walked beside her at a precise distance, not quite close enough to be intimate, not far enough to be indifferent. She noticed he didn't explain things unprompted. He waited for questions. She appreciated this more than she'd expected to. 2 years of being processed and classified and assessed and told what was happening to her had made her sensitive to the difference between information given because it was needed and information given to perform authority. This path, she said, where does it go? Down, he said. And then, when we reach the archway, the light will change. Don't let it unsettle you. Your eyes will adjust within a few seconds. What kind of light? He considered. The light underground is different from surface light. It comes from living things rather than the sky. You'll understand when you see it. The archway appeared between 2 trees so old their roots had fused at the base, a natural architecture that had been enhanced rather than built. Stone fitted into existing gap, the whole structure covered in something that wasn't quite moss, but grew the way moss grew, in patient, incremental layers. Beyond the archway, steps descended. She stopped for just a moment at the threshold, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from something more precise. The instinct to acknowledge a crossing. The sense that stepping through would be a different kind of choice than agreeing in a lawyer's office. More visceral, more real, the way signing a document and actually boarding the plane were the same decision made twice in different registers. She stepped through. The light changed immediately and completely. What had been the gray-purple of early evening became something luminous and sourceless, a soft silver gold that emanated from the walls themselves, from veins of something mineral that ran through the stone like rivers seen from altitude. She stopped walking. She couldn't help it. The passage opened before her into a space that was not a corridor and not quite a cavern. Something in between. The dimensions wrong for underground in the specific way that suggested this space hadn't been hollowed out of the earth, but had been grown, cultivated, expanded over centuries by patient hands and older methods. And it was alive. That was the thing she couldn't quite process in the first moments, that underground had always meant inert, had meant the absence of growing things, but this space was threaded with roots that had been trained into shapes, with water that moved through channels so old and smooth they seemed like natural features, with the sound of something that wasn't quite wind, but moved like wind through the upper reaches of the passage. And there were lights, not electric, not flame, living lights that moved with the specific unpredictability of things that were neither one nor the other, small and drifting and interested. "Your eyes have adjusted," Kyle said quietly beside her. She realized they had. "I didn't notice. You were looking at other things," he said. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, something that had to do with this place specifically. She looked at him, and he was looking at the space around them with an expression she recognized from somewhere she couldn't immediately place. And then, she could. It was the expression of someone looking at home. The path continued, and she walked it beside him, and as they descended, the passage opened into increasingly larger spaces, chambers that had clearly been inhabited and shaped across vast stretches of time. She saw architecture that had absorbed dozens of different sensibilities, old and older and oldest layered in geological strata of style and intention, stone that had been carved by tools she couldn't name, arches that had been grown rather than built, trained from living material into structural permanence, and everywhere that sourceless silver-gold light that came from the walls and the floors and the ceiling, from the place where living stone met living stone and produced something between them. People appeared. She'd braced for this moment, for the scrutiny she'd felt at the vampire court and stories she'd told herself to prepare, but what she met was more complicated and less legible than scrutiny. The beings in the passage, she couldn't call them all people with confidence. Some were people-shaped, and some were something more loosely interpreted, looked at her with varying kinds of attention. Some curious, some reserved, some expressionless in ways that weren't empty, but measured. Some bowed slightly to Kyle. Several looked at her with the specific quality of people revising an existing assessment. She kept her face still. She kept her chin at the angle Saren had told her to keep it, which turned out to be the same angle she'd developed in the visitation room when she needed to be read as someone who hadn't been broken. She met eyes when eyes found hers and didn't look away first. A woman fell into step on Mara's other side, tall and dark-haired, wearing something layered and structured, with a face that managed to be simultaneously warm and unreadable. "I'm Elia," she said. "I've been assigned to stand with you during the ceremony. Think of me as a translation service." "For the language," Mara said. "For all of it," Elia said. She glanced at Kyle on Mara's other side. "He does his best, but he's been rehearsing this as a political event for so long he's forgotten parts of it are simply strange for someone who's never seen below." "Is that common," Mara said, "for the queen to have been human?" Elia considered. "It's traditional," she said. "Whether it's common depends on how you count. We've had human queens before. Some adapted with grace. Some did not adapt at all." She paused. "You seem like someone who has adapted to difficult things before." "A few," Mara said. Elia smiled. "Yes," she said, "we know. The chamber they entered was vast in a way that changed the quality of sound. Mara had been in large spaces, auditoriums and the echoing interior of the county courthouse, where her fate had been decided by a jury that hadn't been able to look at her directly. She knew the particular acoustics of judgment rendered in large rooms. This was different. The sound here was absorbed and returned in ways that suggested the walls were doing something active, that the chamber was participating in what happened within it, rather than merely containing it. And it was full. Not crowded, not packed, but fully inhabited. Every graduated level of the circular space occupied by figures whose attention was turned toward the center, toward the altar that stood on a raised platform of black-veined stone, toward where she and Kyle were walking. She heard her own footsteps and noticed they had a particular confidence she hadn't consciously decided on. She thought about Saren's words. Paying attention despite being afraid. That's the relevant part. She arrived at the altar and turned to face it, and found Kyle already turned to face her, and for a moment that was suspended in the particular amber of ceremony, they looked at each other. She saw in his face the thing she'd been trying to locate since the letter, what he actually was underneath the careful patience and the measured words. What she found was complex and contradictory and unexpectedly real. He looked like a man who had built so many walls so carefully for so long that he'd lost track of which side of them he lived on. He looked like someone who had made peace with loneliness by reclassifying it as independence. And he looked, in this exact moment, like someone who was not entirely certain this was going to be all right, which was the most honest thing she'd seen on his face, and therefore the most comforting. The officiant spoke in a language she didn't know, and Elia translated in a murmur beside her, words about covenant and willing choice, and the particular requirements of the old succession laws, and Mara listened and responded where she was meant to respond, and the vows were short and precise, as she'd been told. And then, the ring. Which was not a ring in any conventional sense, but a band of material that seemed to be made of the same stuff as the walls, dark and luminous, set with a stone that was the precise color of the light in the passage, silver gold and sourceless, and alive in its way. When it settled on her finger, she felt something she had no existing category for, a warmth that moved up through her hand and into her arm. Not uncomfortable, nothing like pain, more like the specific sensation of a connection being established, a circuit completing, current finding its path after a long interruption. Kyle placed the matching band on his own hand, and for just a moment, his eyes closed, and when they opened, they found her immediately with that particular contained quality she'd noticed from the first, but which now had something additional in it. Something that had to do with what had just happened between them in the invisible architecture of old law. She heard something move through the assembled court. Not applause. Not quite. More like the collective release of held breath, a sound that was the acoustic equivalent of things settling into their proper order. Elia leaned close. "Welcome to Veldorn," she said quietly. "My queen." The court gathered after in a space that felt less ceremonial and more inhabited. A long room with a long table and the specific social geometry of people assessing each other while pretending to celebrate. Food appeared that Mara didn't entirely recognize and wine that tasted of something mineral and dark and not unpleasant. She sat to Kyle's right, which Alea had told her was the position of the queen consort by the old laws, and she held herself with the stillness she'd learned and watched the room the way she'd learned to watch rooms. They watched her back. She knew the shapes of assessment, and they were mostly universal. She met each gaze that found her with the same measured acknowledgement and didn't perform more warmth than she had. She had learned that performed warmth was detectable, and that once detected it cost more than the credibility it had been deployed to earn. A man approached, ancient in the way that some things were ancient, carrying it in the specific texture of his manner rather than in visible aging. He wore his authority the way old money wore wealth, invisibly, but unmistakably. He bowed to Kyle with precise depth, then turned to Mara with something in his expression she read immediately as a question disguised as courtesy. "My queen," he said, "we are honored by your presence and your willing consent to the covenant." He paused. It is unusual, in our experience, for a human woman to enter this arrangement with such composure. One wonders what qualities you were told to expect. She understood the question. He was asking what she'd been told, which was another way of asking how much she knew, which was another way of asking whether she could be surprised into revealing something useful. She'd had this conversation in a different register with people at the facility who'd learned that information was currency and were always looking for an exchange rate in their favor. "I was told the truth," she said, "that I'd be entering a covenant with someone who needed what I was able to provide, that it would be entered willingly, or it would mean nothing. She met his eyes. The truth turned out to be sufficient. He studied her for a moment. And what do you make of Veiled Dorn, now that you've seen it? It's extraordinary, she said honestly, and clearly very old, and it functions, which means a great many people have been maintaining it across a very long time, which means there are systems and obligations I don't yet understand. She paused. I expect I'll be learning for a while. He almost smiled. There was something in it that wasn't quite warmth, but might have been a preliminary to warmth, a step in that direction. Yes, he said. I imagine you will. He bowed again. I am Aldrich, Kyle's father's advisor for longer than you'd find it useful to know. I am, he chose the word with visible deliberateness, cautiously pleased. That's more than I expected, Mara said, to be honest. This time he did smile. Good, he said. Honesty tends to serve better here than its alternatives. He moved away and she watched him go and kept her face neutral but filed the information, cautiously pleased from an advisor who'd been around long enough to have strong opinions about what should please him was more than nothing. Kyle leaned slightly toward her. He said something quiet, close enough that it was only for her. Aldrich doesn't do cautiously pleased for people he's written off, he said. Consider yourself partially approved. Only partially, she said. He considers full approval premature until the first real crisis, Kyle said. He'll be watching to see how you handle one. She felt more than saw his attention settle on her with that particular quality it had. So will I, he added. Though I already have a theory. Which is, she said, that you'll be steady, he said, and that the crisis will be more surprised than you are. She looked at him. It was the longest thing he'd said that wasn't explanation or logistics. It sat differently than his other words had. More personal, less like information, and more like the kind of thing people said when they were allowing themselves to actually think about another person, rather than just manage the relationship with them. She didn't know what to do with it yet. She filed it alongside the other things she didn't know what to do with, and returned her attention to the room. Later, when the gathering had thinned to the inner circle, KL showed her things. The library, which occupied 3 levels of a chamber, whose ceiling was one of the living root formations, trained across centuries into something structural and breathtaking. The roots lit from within, by the mineral veins threaded through them. He ran his hand along a shelf of books with the absent care of someone touching something he'd touched 10,000 times. This was my mother's room, originally, he said. She collected everything she could find about the surface world. She was curious about it in a way that wasn't common here. He paused, and the pause had its own texture, something old in it. A grief that had been so long carried it had become part of the topography rather than an event. She died when I was young by our measurement, though it would seem differently measured in years. I'm sorry, Mara said. She meant it 2 years ago, she'd been in a situation where expressing sympathy was often complicated by the calculation of how it would be received. Here she could say it plainly, and let it be what it was. He looked at her. Thank you, he said, in the same plain register, as if they'd agreed, without discussing it, on a particular kind of directness between them. She found she was grateful for it. She was tired, she realized, of indirect things. He showed her the observatory, which was not what the word suggested because it was below ground. It occupied a chamber where the ceiling was made of a crystal so clear and so ancient that it had become transparent, and through it, far above, visible through layers of stone and earth and distance, she could see a smear of light that was the surface sky. Not stars individually, not at this depth, but a faint luminous suggestion of the world above, like light at the bottom of deep water. You can see it, she said. The surface. On clear nights more, he said. He stood beside her looking up. Sometimes I come here and just look. It grounds me. She glanced at him. You miss the surface. I visit it, he said. More than most here. I find it necessary. He was quiet for a moment. My line has always been drawn to the boundary between above and below. It's the nature of the ruling house to hold both. He glanced down, and then at her. I thought it would be important, in choosing a queen, to find someone who understood both ground-level reality and the necessity of death. She thought about her mother's apartment and the correctional facility, and the courthouse and the black car, and this crystal ceiling showing distant sky. She thought about all the layers of the last 48 hours. I understand depth, she said. That part I can promise you. He looked at her, and the expression he wore was one she was beginning to catalog. The specific arrangement of his features when he was deciding to say something he had been sitting with for longer than the immediate conversation. He said quietly, I know this was not what you imagined your life to be. Not this, not a bargain made out of necessity, not an underground kingdom and a covenant with someone you'd never met. She waited. I want you to know that I understand what it cost, he said. What it means to have no options that feel like choices and to choose anyway. The old laws required willingness, and you were willing, and I know that willingness had specific conditions, and I won't pretend otherwise. But he paused. But I'd like, if it's possible, for this to become more than its conditions. Given time. Given the willingness on both parts. She looked up through the crystal ceiling at the faint, impossible light of the surface sky. She thought about the specific arithmetic of what she'd agreed to, and what it had given her, and what it had opened. I think, she said carefully, that I can be willing to find out. The silence that followed felt like something being planted. She learned the kingdom in the way she'd always learned new environments, systematically and through observation, walking the same passages at different hours, noting who occupied which spaces and when, tracking the rhythms of a place to understand its logic before she tried to participate in it. Aaliyah was her guide for the first week. Aldrich, she discovered, was watching from a careful distance that he didn't try to disguise, and that she appreciated for its honesty. The kingdom was bigger than it had any right to be from the outside. The space below ground operated according to different architecture than the surface, the chambers growing and narrowing according to principles that seemed more organic than structural, more grown than built. She stopped trying to map it in straight lines and started feeling it as a living thing with its own internal logic. The way you navigated a forest, by landmark and direction, and the particular quality of light or sound that told you where you were relative to the parts you already knew. The people were similarly complex. She'd expected she hadn't been sure what she'd expected. Something more uniform, perhaps. What she found was a court that had all the internal politics and factions of any closed community that had been functioning for a very long time, with the added dimension of differing natures and abilities and the specific social stratification that came from extreme age differentials. Some of the beings in Vile Dorn were as old as its deepest chambers. Some were young, or relatively young, newcomers to a community that measured newcomer in centuries. The young ones watched her with the most open curiosity. The old ones watched her with something that was harder to categorize. Not unfriendly, most of them, but containing within their regard an entire history of similar situations that she was not privy to. All the previous queens and previous moments, and how those had turned out. She asked Ilya about the previous queens, not tactlessly, not in the first days, but after she'd established enough of a rapport that the question was information rather than accusation. There were 7, Ilya told her. Before you. We don't call them previous queens in formal address. Each was acknowledged in her own right and her own time. What were they like? Mara said. Aaliyah thought about this. Each was different, she said. One was fierce, to the point of causing 3 diplomatic incidents in her first year. One was so quiet, the court initially mistook it for weakness, which was their error rather than hers. She paused. One adapted so completely to life here that she eventually forgot, or chose to forget, what it had meant to be human. That was difficult for Kyle. How long ago was that, Mara said. Very long, Ilya said. He was younger then. more vulnerable to loss in the way that youth makes loss particularly sharp. She looked at Mara with the particular quality of someone deciding how much is useful to share. He is not young now, but he is not armored either. He has learned to be careful with himself in the way of someone who has been careless before and paid full price for it. Mara absorbed this. She filed it alongside the other things she was accumulating about him, the small, specific details of a person that you gathered differently from the information they gave you directly. The way he touched the books in the library with that particular absent tenderness, the way his face changed, almost imperceptibly, when he was below ground versus when they occasionally walked above, how he was more contained on the surface, less himself, as if the underground gravity suited him. The way he listened. She hadn't met many people who listened the way he did, as if the listening was the whole purpose, rather than a waiting room for their own next word. She found him in the library most evenings. It seemed to be where he ended up when the day's formal obligations were concluded, and he had the luxury of going somewhere for reasons that were his own. She started ending up there too, not by calculation but by genuine pull, because the library was extraordinary, and she'd always thought in books, used them the way other people used conversation or music, as a way of sorting out what she thought about things. The first time he found her there unexpectedly, deep in a text about the history of the succession laws, he stopped in the doorway in a way that lasted just long enough to be visible. "I was going to read," he said. "So was I," she said. She looked up. "Is this your space? Do you need it to yourself?" He sat in the chair across from her, which was the furthest point from where she was sitting, and opened his own book, and they read in silence for 2 hours, and it was one of the most comfortable silences she'd experienced in 2 years. The kind of silence that was company rather than the absence of it. After that, it became a thing. Not arranged. Not discussed. Just the accumulated reality of two people who both ended up in the library in the evenings and had stopped finding reasons to leave when the other appeared. He read in 3 languages that she could identify, and at least one she couldn't. She asked him about it one evening, the one she couldn't identify, because she liked the rhythm of it. It's the original language of Vale Dorn. He's older than any surface language. Most of us still read it, though fewer speak it now. He paused. My mother spoke it to me when I was small. He said a phrase in it, low and quiet, and it sounded like water over stone in a very deep place. "What does that mean?" she said. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. "It means, roughly, the ground beneath the ground that is the truest ground. It was what she called this place." He closed the book. She believed that the surface was real, but that this was realer. That depth was where truth accumulated. Mara thought about this. She thought about the correctional facility and the courthouse and her mother's apartment, and how all of those surface world things had felt like the most real things that could possibly exist. She thought about how reality had a way of expanding when you stopped assuming you'd already seen all of it. "I'm starting to understand what she meant," Mara said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression with that quality she was learning to read, the specific small change that meant he was allowing himself to feel something about the immediate situation rather than managing it. "Good," he said simply, and returned to his book. The first crisis arrived 14 days in, which was sooner than Aldrich had apparently expected, because she later learned he'd told Kyle he'd predicted 3 weeks. It arrived in the form of a delegation from one of the outer courts, beings who held territory adjacent to Vale Dorn and had been. Aaliyah explained quickly on their way to the formal chamber, pushing at that adjacency for a long time. Their argument was territorial. Their actual interest was the succession question, which they'd apparently been tracking for years and had now lost, and they were here to either accept or contest the outcome depending on what they found. Their leader was a woman named Thessaly, who looked like winter looked, cold and clear, and without unnecessary elements. She looked at Mara with the specific quality of someone taking a measurement. "You're the human," she said, in the direct way of someone who found pleasantries inefficient. She said it without particular hostility, simply as information being confirmed. I am, Mara said. Thessaly looked at her for a long moment. How did you end up here? She'd been told, by Elia and by Kael, and by Saren in her brief preparation, that the details of her origin were not for court consumption, that her history was her own and she needn't share it, that queens didn't explain themselves to outer court delegations. She'd heard all of this. She'd also developed, in 2 years of being in situations where the power differential was significant and her options were limited, a strong instinct for when the true answer was more useful than the strategic one. I made a choice, she said, under difficult circumstances, in exchange for things I needed for people I loved. And then I got here, and found that the choice was better than I'd understood when I made it. She met Thessaly's eyes. Is that a familiar kind of story where you come from? Something moved in Thessaly's expression. Not warmth. Not yet. Something that was the precondition for warmth, the recognition of a shared grammar. More familiar than you might expect, Thessaly said. Then we might understand each other, Mara said. Eventually, Thessaly's eyes moved to Kael briefly, then back. He chose well, she said, which in the specific register of a territorial dispute being suspended was more than it sounded. Aldrich, she noticed later, had positioned himself near the entrance of the chamber and had watched the whole exchange without moving. She caught his eye across the room. He gave her a small nod, barely a motion, the kind of acknowledgement made by people who've decided not to reconsider being cautiously pleased. The rhythm of weeks settled into her the way new rhythms did, gradually, and then, all at once, she stopped waking disoriented, stopped having the particular dream she'd had almost every night for 2 years, in which she was still in the facility and the release had not happened. Started dreaming instead in the sourceless silver-gold light of Vile Dorn, which she took as her subconscious updating its files and filing her life under its current address. Her mother called on the 6th day. Mara had been given a device that worked below ground through means she'd stopped needing to understand because understanding the mechanisms was less important than having the ability. Eleanor Voss's voice came through with the particular quality of voices that had been strained by months of worry and were tentatively releasing that strain. You sound different, Eleanor said. Better or worse, Mara said. A pause. Better, Eleanor said. More rested. More yourself. Mara thought about how to explain and then thought about her mother's lifetime of practicality, the woman who'd raised a daughter alone and kept them both fed through the specific creativity of someone who understood scarcity intimately and refused to be destroyed by it. The woman who'd sat across from her in the visitation room and spoken in code about heating repairs because she wouldn't add the weight of her own hardships to what her daughter was carrying. She told her, not everything, not the supernatural architecture of it, not the old laws and the covenant and the nature of what Vale Dorn was, but the essential shape, that she'd married someone, that he was unusual, that she was somewhere extraordinary, that she was safe in ways that felt genuine rather than performed, and that Eleanor's medical care was real and ongoing, and not contingent on anything except Mara having said yes to something she hadn't fully understood when she'd agreed. You married a stranger, Eleanor said, in the tone of a woman summarizing. I married someone who needed what I could offer, Mara said, and offered things I needed in return. Silence, then. Is he kind to you? Mara thought about the library, about the careful silences, about the phrase in the old language that meant the truest ground, about the way his face had looked, at the altar, when he wasn't managing himself, which was the most honest thing she'd seen from him in all the careful conversations since. He's trying to be, she said honestly, and he's good at the things he's trying to do. Eleanor's voice softened. That's better than most, she said. It's better than I had. Mara's throat did the thing. She breathed through it. I know, she said. Tell me about the place, Eleanor said. this extraordinary somewhere. Mara told her. She described the mineral light and the living roots and the crystal ceiling through which you could see the faintest smear of surface sky on clear nights. She described Elia and Aldrich and Thessaly and the long library. She described the sound of the deep water that ran through the lowest passages, which she'd heard, but not yet seen. Eleanor listened and made small sounds of genuine interest, the particular sounds of someone who had always found the world astonishing and was finding new evidence for the position. "You were always going to end up somewhere extraordinary," Eleanor said at the end. "I told you that when you were small. You told me I had the kind of attention that found things," Mara said. "Not quite the same." "Same thing," Eleanor said. Her voice had the specific quality of someone getting tired, the medication and the managed illness weighing on the later part of the day. "I should sleep, baby. But I'm glad you called. I'm glad you're safe. More than safe." She paused. "Mara," she said her daughter's name the way mothers said names, the full weight of knowing someone from before they could speak encoded in the 2 syllables. "You don't have to make it work just because you agreed to it. But if you want to, I think you might have something worth making." "How can you tell?" Mara said. "Because you sound like yourself," Eleanor said. "And when you mentioned him just now, the trying to be kind part, you didn't sound like someone making the best of a situation. You sounded like someone paying attention." She paused. "You always paid the best attention to the things that mattered most." She slept before they finished saying goodbye, and Mara stayed on the connection for a moment after, listening to her mother's breathing, steady and medicated and alive, and thought about all the arithmetic of the last 3 weeks, all the things exchanged and owed and given, and what they had added up to. She found KL in the observatory. He was standing in his usual spot, looking up through the crystal ceiling at the distant surface light, and he heard her come in without turning around, which she'd learned was just how he was, his senses carrying more information than hers did, and operating faster with it. "My mother thinks I should make it work," she said. She came to stand beside him. She looked up through the sky was clear above, and the light was stronger than she'd seen it. Still no individual stars at this depth, but a luminous suggestion of them, a texture of light that implied enormity. "What did you tell her?" he said. "I told her I was paying attention," Mara said. He was quiet. She could feel the specific quality of his attention, even when it wasn't aimed at her directly, the weight of a person who was present in an unusual degree. "I want to show you something," he said after a moment. "Will you come?" She followed him through passages she was learning, down and then down again, into the deep places she hadn't yet been. The air changed with the descent, grew warmer and wetter, and the sound of water grew louder, resolving from a general impression into specific sound, moving water, fast water, water with purpose. The passage opened. She stopped breathing for just a second. Not from fear. From the specific involuntary response of encountering something the mind recognized as transcendent before the conscious apparatus had processed what it was looking at. The underground river was immense. Not wide, not relative to the surface rivers she'd seen, but the way it occupied the space of its cavern was immense, the walls of the chamber shaped by centuries of its passage into something that was simultaneously geological and architectural, the water black and fast and lit from below by veins of mineral so dense and luminous they turned the river itself into a source of light. The sound of it was physical, she could feel it in her chest, and above the river, spanning it at a height that required you to tilt your head back to see the arc of it, was a bridge of root-grown stone so old it had become part of the thing it crossed. She looked at it for a long time. "My mother's favorite place," Cale said beside her. She called it the heart of the deep country. He was looking at the river rather than at her. "I haven't brought anyone here in a very long time." She understood what that meant. not as a declaration, but as a marker. The kind of thing people said when they were allowing something to be said between them that hadn't been named yet, that maybe didn't need naming, but needed acknowledging in some form, through some action, through being present together in a place that mattered. "Thank you," she said, the same plain register she'd used when he'd told her about his mother's death, the one that let a thing be what it was without amplification. He looked at her. The river light caught his face and made it something else, softer and more complicated and more genuinely him than she'd seen it in any formal or careful moment. She found that she wanted to keep looking. She looked. He didn't look away either. The river moved between them and beneath them and around them, the oldest thing in a place full of old things, making the same sound it had made for an age before either of them existed, indifferent to their standing there, and therefore entirely accommodating of whatever they chose to do with the moment. The 23rd day brought the letter. Not a letter from outside she'd stopped thinking of outside as the relevant direction. It arrived through a courier who moved the way all the fast movers in Val Dorn moved, more quickly than the eye tracked correctly, appearing with the message and then simply not being there anymore before she'd quite processed that they'd gone. The message was brief and written on the same heavy cream paper as the first letter she'd received, though this one was from a different hand, formal and official where the first had been specific and personal. She brought it to Elia. Elia read it and said nothing for a moment, and the quality of that nothing was informative. "What is it?" Mara said. "A challenge to the succession," Elia said. "To you, specifically, to the validity of your consent," she explained. The old laws, which governed the succession covenant, required not only willing consent, but what Elia called true consent, a concept that had an exact legal definition in the traditions of the deep courts. The argument being made, by a faction Elia named with a careful lack of expression, was that consent given under conditions of extreme external pressure duress in the surface world legal register could not constitute true consent under the old laws. The argument was that Mara's circumstances at the time of the letter, her imprisonment and her mother's illness and her financial devastation, had constrained her choices so severely that the willingness she'd expressed was not freely given, but extracted. And if the covenant was not validly formed, it could be dissolved. And if it could be dissolved, the succession question reopened. Mara sat with this for a moment. She recognized the argument from the inside in a way she hadn't expected to, because she'd made a version of it to herself in those early hours after the letter, turning it over to see where the honesty was and where the rationalization was, and where the line between a real choice and an apparent one actually ran. "Where is Kyle?" she said. "He knows," Elia said. "He's with Aldrich." She paused. "He's not happy. Because of the challenge to the succession," Mara said. Elia looked at her with something careful and warm and honest. "Because of what the challenge implies about you," she said, "about what was done to you. By those who framed you and by those who structured the contract without considering how it might look from the outside. He blames himself for the latter, more than is perhaps useful." Mara stood. He was in Aldrich's study, which was a room of deep shelves and deep thought, and the particular temperature of a space where difficult things were regularly processed. He was standing. She'd learned that he stood when he was working something through, sat when he was settled on it. He was standing. He turned when she came in, and she could see immediately what Elia had described. Not unhappiness, something more specific. The expression of someone who had done something they'd thought was right, and had just been shown a way in which it had caused harm. "I've read the challenge," she said. "Mara," he said. His voice had its usual evenness, but there was something underneath it. "I need to tell you that if the argument they're making carries any truth for you, if you feel that your consent was not stop," she's not unkindly, but firmly, in the register of someone who was done waiting for the end of the sentence. He stopped. She sat down, which put her in the lower position in the room, which was a deliberate choice because she was not performing authority right now, she was having a conversation. "Let me tell you about consent under duress," she said. "I'm something of an expert, given the last 2 years." She looked at him steadily. "Consent under duress means you chose from a limited set of options with meaningful external pressure on the outcome. It doesn't mean the consent was false. It means it was hard. There's a difference." He sat down across from her. Aldrich, she noticed, had arranged himself near the wall in the specific way of someone making themselves furniture because the situation called for the two principals to be alone in it. "I chose," she said, "with full information, as much as I had, under circumstances that were difficult and not of my making." She paused. "I have made choices my entire life under circumstances not of my making. That's been my life." She met his eyes. "If the old laws can't accommodate a woman who chose deliberately and willingly under pressure, then the old laws need revision, and I might point out that I'm the queen consort now, and revising outdated law seems like exactly the kind of thing a queen consort from the surface world might bring some perspective to." Aldrich made a sound. Not quite a laugh, something that was the internal equivalent of a smile, expressed as a minimal quantity of breath. Kael was looking at her with that expression she'd started to see as his most honest face, the one that appeared when he wasn't managing the situation, but responding to it. "I still feel responsible," he said. "For the conditions." "I know," she said. "That's appropriate. Hold on to it. But don't let it become the conclusion that I was a victim of it. Because I wasn't. I was an agent inside it." She paused. An agent who is quite happy, as it happens, with where the agency got her. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. Fuller. Somehow more certain about itself. "I'll respond to the challenge," he said finally. "The old laws allow me to provide testimony on the nature of the arrangement and the clarity of the offering made." "We'll respond," she said. He looked at her. "Together," she said. "I'm the one whose consent is being questioned. I should probably be the one answering." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "You probably should." The formal response happened 2 days later. Mara stood in the court chamber and addressed the challenge directly, in her own words, without preparation beyond knowing what she thought and being willing to say it. She talked about what it meant to choose when choices were limited. She talked about the specific weight of the decision she'd made and how she'd carried it before and after, and how carrying it had felt increasingly like carrying something she wanted to carry rather than something she had no alternative to. She talked about 23 days in a kingdom underground, and a library she returned to every evening, and a bridge over a river lit from beneath. She talked about the mathematics of a life that had been narrowed by external forces and then expanded by a choice made inside that narrowing. She said, "My consent was real. I want to be here. And if the laws of this court cannot accommodate a queen who arrived through necessity and decided to stay through something else, then we will revise the laws. Because that is precisely the kind of thing queens are for." The chamber was still. Aldrich, from his position at the wall, made the same minimal sound again. This time she was certain it was a laugh. The challenge was withdrawn by that evening. The 31st day was the day she saw the upper world from below in a way she hadn't seen it before. She'd gone to the crystal ceiling chamber alone, which she did sometimes when she needed the particular quality of thinking that happened when she looked up through ancient stone at the faint light of the sky. She'd learned to think better here, the two directions of her life made visible simultaneously, the surface she'd come from, and the depth she now inhabited. The synthesis of them visible in the act of looking through stone at sky. She was sitting with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up when Kael found her, which meant she heard him before she saw him, a change in the chamber's acoustics that announced someone coming. He came in and registered her position and sat down beside her, against the same wall. Not the chair in the center of the room that was the ceremonial vantage point, not at the formal distance he maintained in court and common spaces, but beside her, close enough that she could feel the different temperature of him, slightly cooler than a human person, the specific characteristic she'd stopped noticing as strange and had started registering as his particular quality. They looked up at the sky together. She'd been thinking about her mother's last call, which had been 3 days ago, and had been shorter than usual, the energy more rationed, the voice more tired. She'd been thinking about the particular arithmetic of loving someone who was dying by increments, which was an arithmetic she'd been doing for years, and which didn't get easier, only more familiar. He seemed to know, without her saying. He had a quality she'd been mapping for a month now, a specific awareness of emotional weather in people near him, not intrusive, not performed, but genuine and quiet, the same way he listened. He sat beside her and let her have the thoughts she was having, and didn't try to move her through them faster than they wanted to move. She said, "She's getting worse." He said, "I know. I had a report from the nurse this morning." She looked at him. He looked back. The fact that he'd been receiving reports and tracking her mother's condition without making it a thing he needed credit for was so characteristic of the specific way he moved through obligations that she'd come to trust that it was real rather than performed. "Is she comfortable?" Mara said. "Yes," he said. "As much as is possible. She's being well cared for." He paused. "She asked the nurse to tell you she's proud of you." Mara's throat did the thing. She tilted her head back against the wall and looked at the crystal ceiling and the sky beyond it, and breathed through the grief that had been accumulating since long before the letter. The specific kind of grief that begins years before a loss arrives. He said, "I lost my mother to a different kind of sudden. It was different from what you're living. But I remember that the anticipation of a loss changes you before it arrives." She let him talk. He was quiet for a moment. "What I found, eventually, was that the grief and the love were the same thing in different seasons. That they didn't compete. That you could hold both." His profile against the crystal ceiling and the sky, the particular line of his jaw, and the way the underground light caught his eyes and made them the specific color she'd spent 31 days looking for a word for, and still hadn't found. She thought about what Elia had said about the queen who had forgotten what it meant to be human, and about how Kyle had not forgotten what it meant to lose something irreplaceable, and how those two facts were connected. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the stone floor. She felt him go very still, the particular stillness of something unexpected arriving in a place that had been carefully prepared for everything except the unexpected. Then, his hand turned under hers, and held it. They sat like that, and looked at the sky, and the grief and the love were the same thing in different seasons, and both were present and neither consumed the other, and the crystal ceiling held the light of the surface, world above them, and the mineral light of the deep country below them, and she was in both places at once, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, that felt like exactly enough. "I'm glad you chose me," she said quietly, even if the choosing was complicated. He was quiet for a moment, the quality of quiet that was thought rather than absence. Then, the choosing was not complicated, he said. "I looked at 100 files and read 100 histories, and there was yours, and there was nothing complicated about it." He paused. "Everything after was complicated. You were not." She smiled. She'd discovered he made her do that, specifically, not the generic smile of social interaction, but the one that came from being surprised by something that was genuinely good. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "Please," he said. "I thought, when I got here, that this would be something I managed." She looked at the sky, something I survived with dignity and turned into something livable. She paused. "I did not expect to find it genuinely good. I did not expect to find you genuinely good." He said nothing for a moment. "Then, no one has described me as genuinely good in a very long time. That's their failure, not yours," she said. The silence that followed was the warmest one yet. She'd been cataloging them. This one was warm enough to be almost luminous, like the mineral veins in the walls, giving off its own specific light. She thought about the correctional facility and the beige walls and the 11 minutes of gold light at 3 o'clock. She thought about learning to find beauty in ration-sized portions. She thought about how the portions had been growing, steadily, since the letter, since the car ride and the stone house and the descent and the bridge over the lit river and the library and the challenge to the succession and the crystal ceiling. She thought about how it was possible to make a choice under impossible circumstances and have it be, nonetheless, entirely the right one. Her mother died on a morning when the underground light was particularly beautiful. Mara learned it the way she learned most things now, from someone who cared about how she received it. Aaliyah came to her rooms before she'd risen, with tea and with the particular quality of presence of someone who has come to be beside you rather than to tell you something, though they have something to tell. The nurse called an hour ago, Aaliyah said. She went quietly. She was comfortable. She was not alone. Mara sat on the edge of the bed and held the tea. She felt the specific enormity of a weight that had been there so long she'd stopped registering it as separate from herself. She felt it not lift, not disappear, but change shape, transform from anticipation into something else. Grief without its future, the past-present tense of loving someone who is now only a memory, and the memories themselves, permanent and irreducible. She drank the tea, she breathed, she sat with it, the way she'd learned to sit with large things, without trying to process them faster than they wanted to be processed. Kyle found her later in the observatory, looking up through the crystal ceiling at a sky that was overcast, the surface light diffuse and gray, and somehow appropriate. He came and sat beside her on the stone floor, with the same wordlessness he'd brought to the last time, the same understanding that this was not a moment for management or efficiency, or even comfort, in any conventional sense. He brought his presence. He brought his steadiness. He brought the specific quality of someone who was not afraid of the size of grief, and would sit inside it with you without trying to reduce it. She told him things about her mother. The kind of things you told people after, the small specific memories that felt most urgent in the first hours, as if saying them made them more permanent, put them somewhere safer than the inside of your own head. She told him about the particular creativity Eleanor Voss had applied to scarcity, the things she'd made from almost nothing that had seemed like abundance to a child who didn't know yet to want more. She told him about the way her mother had always found the extraordinary in things other people walked past. She told him she'd learned that from her. The paying attention to extraordinary things. He listened to everything. After a long time, she said, she told me I'd end up somewhere extraordinary. She believed it when I didn't. He said, she was right. Mara looked at him. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention in a way that was different from how he usually aimed it, less careful, less managed, more direct, as if the situation had dissolved the last layer of the careful distance, and what remained was simply him, looking at her, thinking the thought that was on his face. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. He said, I chose you with calculation. I need you to know that first. I read your file, and I identified qualities I needed, and I engineered circumstances to make the offer possible for you to accept. He held her gaze. I am not proud of the calculation. I have thought about it every day since you arrived. Whether it was right, whether I had the standing to make that kind of decision about another person's life. She held the gaze back. And, she said, and I have also, he paused, choosing words with the care she'd come to recognize as his particular form of honesty, finding the exact ones rather than the approximately right ones. I have also found that the calculation brought me something I had not calculated for. He paused again. You, not what I needed. You, specifically, who you are when you're not managing a situation, which is most of the time. Who you are in the library, and beside the river, and in this room right now, sitting with a grief that is enormous and making it look like steadiness. He looked at her with that most honest expression. I find that I am he stopped. She waited. I find that I don't want this to be a contract, he said finally. I want it to be a life. His voice was quiet. If you want that too. If that's even possible from where we started. She thought about the specific series of events that had led to this stone floor, and this crystal ceiling, and this man beside her. All the accidents and injustices and desperate choices that had accumulated into a path she wouldn't have designed, and that had led somewhere extraordinary nonetheless. She thought about her mother's voice. That's better than most. She looked at Kyle. She said, I think we started the only place we could have, and I think we've been building something else since we arrived. She paused. I think the contract is the floor, not the ceiling. He was still. She said, I'm already here. I already chose. I'm choosing again now, with more information, under less pressure, which means this one is cleaner. She met his eyes. So yes, a life. The thing that happened on his face was not the shadow of a smile this time, not the approximate expression. It was the full thing. She hadn't seen it before. It made him look younger and older simultaneously, the way a very old thing looks when it encounters something that reminds it of the reasons it began. He reached over and took her hand. The same gesture she'd made in this room 2 weeks before returned to her now with the same warmth and the same intention. She held on. Below them, the mineral river moved in the deep passages. Above them, the overcast sky diffused its light through crystal and stone. And in the space between the surface world and the deep country, in the particular territory that was neither and both, two people who had found each other through calculation and necessity, and a letter written in ink pressed into paper like a claim, held on to what they'd built from the wreckage of worse circumstances. And it was not, she thought, a bad place to be. The months that followed were the education she'd agreed to undertake, which turned out to be the most genuinely interesting, sustained engagement of her mind she could remember. She'd always learned in the way that consumed her, once she had something worth consuming. In 2 years of the correctional facility, she'd read every book in the library twice, had taken every available course, had studied the facility itself as a system, and understood its internal logic better than most of the staff. Now she had a kingdom to learn, which was different in scale and in kind, and in the specific pleasure of it. She worked through the old laws with Aldrich, who was a better teacher than his manner initially suggested. Methodical and exacting, but with a genuine investment in the quality of her understanding. He did not simplify for her. She appreciated this. Simplification was a form of assessment she'd always found condescending, the implicit claim that the person being simplified for couldn't handle the real thing. Aldrich gave her the real thing and let her handle it. She had ideas about the laws almost immediately. The old laws were ancient and functional and deeply embedded in the social fabric of Vale Dorn, but they'd been written for a world that had existed before, and some of them bore the specific marks of assumptions that were no longer universal. She brought these observations to Aldrich first, then to Kyle, then to a court session, and the debate that followed was the most alive she'd felt in a formal set. The human queens before her, she'd learned, had mostly been quiet presences, symbols rather than participants. There was an expectation built into the role, she could feel it, that the queen consort would be decorative in the specific way that powerful institutions had always made space for certain kinds of presence, while directing real engagement elsewhere. She had no interest in this version. She had the specific kind of interest in institutions that came from having been failed by one, the interest that wanted to understand the machinery well enough to identify where it was failing, and say so. Kael watched her do this with an expression that had become one of her favorites in his repertoire. Not quite pride, something more complex and more personal. The expression of someone watching a thing they'd hoped for but hadn't been certain of, arriving exactly as imagined and then going somewhat beyond it. "You're rewriting the succession laws," he said one evening in the library. Not as a criticism, more as an observation of a fact that continued to be interesting. I'm proposing revisions, she said. There's a process. You're proposing revisions so specific and well-reasoned that the process has no real grounds for rejection, he said, which is the effective equivalent. She looked at him. Is that a problem? No, he said. He looked at the book he was holding without looking at it, the way he did when he was actually thinking about something else. I'm trying to remember if I expected this. I think I expected competence and didn't expect what's actually happening. Which is, she said. Transformation, he said. Not of you. Of us. Of the court. He set the book down. It's strange to watch something change that has been static for a very long time. Strange and valuable. He looked at her. You make things ask questions about themselves. That's my superpower. 2 years of a system asking questions about my character, I got very good at returning the favor. He smiled. She still catalogued them, the smiles, still found them significant, still thought she might be finding them significant for a very long time. The upper world was something she negotiated carefully. She went above twice a month, with Kael or with Il, and she visited the grave she'd arranged for her mother in a cemetery near the apartment where Eleanor Voss had lived and worked and loved her daughter, through the kind of life that didn't announce itself as remarkable, and was. She brought flowers, which was a thing her mother would have considered unnecessarily sentimental, and therefore exactly right. She talked. The way you talked to people who weren't there anymore, but were somehow still in every relevant conversation you had, because they'd made you, and who you were was partly the record of their making. She talked to her mother about Vael Dorn, about the river and the library and the old laws she was revising, about Kael, about which was something she was still mapping, but which had a clarity and a direction that felt increasingly her own. She thought, Mom was right. I ended up somewhere extraordinary. She thought, she would have liked the river. Kael came with her on the third visit. He stood at a respectful distance while she did what she did, and then when she turned to leave he came alongside her, and she noticed he'd brought something. A small stone from the underground, the kind that held the mineral light, and he'd left it quietly at the base of the headstone, the deep country's material reaching up to mark the place where someone he'd never met had made the person he was standing beside. She looked at the stone, and looked at him, and felt the specific complexity of loving someone that was both simple and entirely beyond adequate description. They walked back through the city in the afternoon light, which was warm and ordinary, and suffused with the particular quality of a surface day in the right season. She walked beside him, and thought about how long this had been coming without her knowing it was coming. All the small moments accumulating into this one, this afternoon, this gravity. She said it the same way she said true things, directly and without performance. He stopped walking, just for a moment, just long enough for the full weight of the words to arrive and be received. Then, he looked at her, and she saw everything she needed to see in his face, all the centuries of careful distance, and the patient waiting that had predated her by more time than she could hold, and the particular transformation that had happened in the 31 days and the months since, the slow conversion of a contractual arrangement into something that needed a different word. He said, I love you. In the same register, direct and certain and without the performance of a declaration, which made it more of a declaration than declarations usually were. They stood on the pavement in the ordinary afternoon light, and it was the simplest and most significant moment of all the moments that had accumulated since a Tuesday, and a letter pressed into cream paper. Then they walked on, back toward the old trees and the descent and the deep country that was home. On the night of the first year's anniversary, Kael showed her a room she hadn't found in 12 months of learning the kingdom. She'd thought she'd found all of them. She'd covered the passages and chambers, with the systematic thoroughness she applied to everything, mapping Vale Dorn in layers, understanding its logic, feeling its rhythms the way she now felt the rhythm of the mineral light, which changed across the day in patterns she could read the way she'd once read the beige walls' cracks. She'd found the armory and the archive and the lower gardens where things grew without light, in ways that were still quietly astonishing to her. She'd thought she'd found everything. The room was behind a passage she'd gone down 100 times, through a door she'd assumed was structural, an assumption she now recognized as a failure of her own imagination. The door was stone and seamless, and opened when Kyle placed his hand against it, a sound like a slow breath, and beyond was a space that was smaller than most of the chambers she knew, but had a quality the larger spaces didn't. It was full of windows. Real windows, somehow, set into stone walls at impossible angles, and through them came real daylight, refracted through crystal and stone and angles of physics that she didn't try to understand, arriving in the underground room with the particular quality of surface sun, warm and specific, and golden with the late afternoon hour above. She stood in the center of the room in a column of underground sunlight and felt the specific physical joy of warmth on her face after a year of mineral light, which was beautiful but different, and laughed, which was the right response. She felt him watching. "My mother built this room," Kyle said from the doorway, "so she could have sunlight, so she wouldn't have to choose." Mara turned. He was in the doorway, in the light that was both surface and underground, and he had the expression she'd learned to read, the most honest one, the one reserved for the moments when he was fully present in the way that most people were only rarely. She said, "I love that she made this." He said, "I love that you're in it." They stayed there until the surface light changed to evening, and the room became the same silver gold as the rest of the kingdom. She thought about all the rooms she'd been in, the correctional facilities accounting, and the courthouse and the black car and the stone house. She thought about the hospice waiting room smell of the visitation room, and how far that particular odor seemed from anything she was currently inhabiting. She thought about how you could be in one kind of room for so long that you stopped imagining there were other kinds, and how the imagination's failure was not the world's ceiling, and how often the decision that felt like necessity turned out to be the right one, even though it had arrived in the wrong way and under the wrong circumstances. She thought about a Tuesday letter pressed into cream paper. She turned to Kyle. She said, "Tell me about the next year. What happens?" He said, "The southern houses are finalizing their alliance, which will be good for the outer territories. The revised succession laws go into formal adoption in 3 months." He paused. Aldrich has moved from cautiously pleased to simply pleased, which he'll never say directly, but has been expressing through the unusual phenomenon of laughing at my jokes. She smiled. "I meant more personally," she said. He considered. "Then, I'd like to travel. I'd like to show you the other deep courts, the ones in other parts of the world. Some are very different from Vale Dorn. Some are older. I'd like to see things through your eyes for a while. You notice things I've stopped noticing." "What things?" she said. "All of it," he said. "All the things you find extraordinary that I've been walking past for centuries." He met her gaze. "You make the world new. I find that I need that, more than I'd expected to need it." She crossed the room to where he was standing. She put her hands on his face, which was something she did now without the earlier calculation of appropriate distance, just the natural reach of someone who had located the geography of another person and found it entirely familiar. She said, "I'm going to keep doing that. I should warn you. Please," he said, with the specific quiet of someone meaning something much larger than the single word. She kissed him in the room of impossible underground sunlight, in the kingdom she'd woken up inside, in the life she'd been handed under terrible circumstances and taken hold of with both hands and made into something worth holding. She kissed him with the full weight of 12 months of accumulated choice, every small decision to stay and engage and grow into the space that had been made available. He kissed her back with 12 months of his own, which were different months, longer in memory and shorter in the specific quality of aliveness, and she felt in the kiss the particular arithmetic of two people who had found each other through unlikely means and been changed, both of them, into something they'd been heading toward without knowing the destination. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. She listened to the deep kingdom around them, the water moving in the lowest passages, the mineral light doing its quiet work in the stone walls. The distant sounds of a court that was learning, slowly, to be different from what it had always been. She thought, "This is mine, not because I was given it, because I made it so." She thought about Aldrich. She thought about the challenge to the succession and her own words in the court chamber, the ones about consent and necessity and choosing again with more information. She thought about Thessaly and her cautious respect that had grown across months and one particularly well-navigated border dispute into something closer to alliance. She thought about Elia, whose friendship was one of the genuinely unexpected gifts, real and particular and unearned, except by showing up consistently as yourself. She thought about the bridge over the river and the crystal ceiling and the library and a room of underground sunlight and all the passages she'd walked until they became familiar and all the laws she'd read until they became hers to work with. She thought about her mother. She thought, living it well, making it count. "I am, Mom," she said to Kyle. The thing she thought on that anniversary in that room in that light, "I want 999 more years of this." She paused. "I want to run out of years before we run out of things to find." He held her face in his hands with the careful tenderness she'd learned was his truest quality, the one that lived underneath all the centuries, and the careful management and the measured words. He said, "Then we will begin." Outside and above, in the world that was the surface of a larger thing, the day was ending in all the usual ways. The light moved across stone and water and city and countryside and found its way, eventually, into the deep places where it arrived, and in the deep country, in the kingdom that existed below the world that most people believed was the only one, in a room built by a woman who hadn't wanted to choose between two kinds of light. The first year ended, and the next 999 began. Not with ceremony, not with declaration, with two people who had found each other in the wrong way and at the right time, choosing, again, the life they'd built from what they'd been given. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.